morning. Good morning again. I guess the microphone wasn't on. Are we all set?
Yes.
Okay. So what I thought I'd do today is start from where we left off last day, because I didn't get through a few last slides, so that we can, let's see, move. No, that doesn't work. I need the, thank you. So this is where we kind of ended off last day, talking about commodities and spaces and thinking of cities as processes. Now, one of the problems we were talking about, this is not working. Okay, this is not working. So one of the problems we was talking about is that in the matter of abstraction and how very concrete commodities, objects and produce, when they become commodities, lend to different sort of systems and processes and lends to different kinds of buildings. You really have to rethink space. What is happening here? Thank you. So the idea that the grading of wheat and processing of wheat required a new system of communication, a new system of thinking about the market, also required a new building entirely. And that's the Chicago Board of Trade trading pit, this interior view. If I ask you how to describe it, how would you describe this space? Take a good look. What does it look like?
It's quite embellished, ornamental.
It's very embellished. It's ornamental, right? Very different from the factory building by Schinkel that we saw yesterday, right? So what do you make of that? Why is it so ornamental? I mean, this is, look at the date. It's 1885. In Chicago, they're building these tall buildings which are completely new in their vocabulary, in their construction system. So why this? Yeah.
So much importance.
Well, they are, when they're building tall buildings, they're trying to show their importance. But what kind of importance? Why this kind of embellishment? It looks like an Italian palazzo, okay? Actually, not most Italian palazzos would be like that. It looks like something from the past. You're drawing from past vocabulary, and you're trying to make it look, well, palatial. Let's call it that, yeah.
It's trying to connect the stereotypical image of merchants with opulence, because it's a building of a board of trade. So it's like trying to show how merchants were open in the past and how they are still a very prosperous, a very economic and powerful class. So it's like trying to show the interior of the building.
So this, despite the fact that Chicago is a space of crass commercialism, okay, this is capitalism, finding its own feet. It's still referring back to a past, an architectural vocabulary of the past, to kind of justify, to find some respectability, if you will. But it did require. I mean, look at the design of the pits here. They did require rethinking what that space would be like. So it's a very large, enormous interior space. And it was well advertised in media. So in other words, you're not just talking about physical buildings, you're talking also of a certain kind of media circulation. You're talking about people who may not be there actually, doing the trading. They would also know about this building. They would know something about the trade, because it does affect them. So in other words, there is a big deal of what is called boosterism at work here. Boosterism about the city, about the trade, about this, newfangled Chicago Board of Trade. This is not working. I think the battery must have died. Okay, great. Need somebody to help with this? That's better. what did develop in Chicago, and this is one of the Chicago's big architectural achievements, is that architects really did rethink what this newfangled building type, like office buildings, where white-collar work would be conducted, would actually look like. We have seen lots of office buildings, so much of it may not seem very new to us. But again, I want you to think about the 19th century and think about how tremendously novel these sort of kinds of buildings were. What it took for, this is Henry Hobson Richardson's Marshall Field wholesale store, and the offices connected to that store. And if you look at this again, the form of the building occupies an entire block. So there is a problem of not only how you're going to organize the interior space, and this is basically a series of columns, and there are 2 service cores, and that's it. Okay, so if there would necessarily be a court inside, because you do need light. Light is very important for task lighting. So they are putting in a lot of windows on the periphery, like in the external walls, because again, when these buildings are being built, there's still no electricity. Okay, so they're task lighting, natural lighting is premium. But what is interesting is that when you look at the interior space and the exterior articulation of the design, like what does the envelope of the building look like? What would the building look like from outside? That is the design. They're borrowing the vocabulary of an Italian palazzo, because they don't that is the closest they can think of that would sort of fit the bill, if you will. And this is fairly typical among what the architectural, the 1880s buildings that are being built in Chicago downtown. But in 1871, what has happened is that a good chunk of Chicago has burned down because of fire. So it did create an opportunity to rethink building types, rethink how to allocate space. And some of the buildings that came up, even if they were masonry buildings, like the Monadnock building, it actually has a very heavy wall, and the wide wall at the bottom, and then it tapers up. And that building would be an exceptional achievement because it's very tall. Now, tall buildings come with, first of all, there's no precedence of such tall buildings unless it's a, kind of a minaret or kind of a singular structure. But livable space, it's unusual. The closest you could think of are, big forts, which would have very heavy walls, very wide walls for buttressing and so on and so forth. But the objective here is to really make the walls as thin as possible, because you want to have the light enter the space. So, making the walls thin is a goal in itself. So what would happen is that, when you're building buildings that are that tall, you are also obliged to think about how you're going to actually ground it, like what the foundations are going to be, and what the material is going to be. So the introduction of Bessemer steel, in other words, high quality steel for construction, enabled the construction of these buildings and really gave Chicago downtown, let's call it a different look. The form became different. And this building, this is William LeBaron Jennings Fair building. And it is essentially a steel cage. And it's a perfect grid. So in a way, the grid of the city is being replicated in the structural system. But one of the problems with steel is that steel actually buckles under high heat. The most notorious example of that is the complete collapse of the World Trade Center with high heat, like jet fuel combustion, that kind of heat. So it needs to be protected. So they had figured that out very, very early on. So I'll show it with this. No, it's not working. So putting insulation around steel columns meant that you had to think about how to protect those essential elements. Otherwise, without that, another fire, the building would collapse. So steel is really good. Steel is good in tension. Its tensile strength is really good. And what would happen in the next few decades is that something else would get combined with that, which is concrete, and you get the the sum total of reinforced concrete, which is an extraordinarily stable building material. But this is building with steel, and the idea that you can actually design a steel cage and then do fill-ins. In other words, you're just, the walls don't no longer need to support anything besides themselves. They don't need to support the load. The load is being carried through the structure itself, the steel structure itself. And the same thing with the grid of columns. The grid of columns is taking the load. The walls can be really anything. I'm going to step out of the camera and do it here. This is what it looks like. So if your grid is like this is your structural grid, and these are the columns which are taking the load. Your wall could be like this, which is, normal. It could be like this, which you'll see an example of, or it could be like this. It doesn't matter, because if you can build it, and if it holds its own weight, you can do anything. Suddenly, the opportunities of formal manipulation of buildings increases like by leaps and bounds. So what this required is also because Chicago, a riverine region, like many of these port cities are, they're soft soil. So they really had to think about how to sort of place these buildings on the soft soil. So a lot of innovation with foundation design, and these are, I'm not going to get into the details, but just to give you a sense of how much innovation went into these designs, it's quite extraordinary. And this is the aspect that I was talking about. Now here are the grid of columns. These are the walls. The walls have no role to support the weight of the roof, which is what you need to carry down to the ground, otherwise the building won't stand. Most masonry buildings, the walls carry the load of the roof. These are not straightforward masonry buildings. Many of them are steel buildings, and even those that have masonry, they're mostly for the envelope, really. Those the walls. What they're doing here is that what this enabled the architect, so these are the columns, is to have the window move out of the periphery of the building. So almost think of it as like gathering more light, because task lighting is very important. But equivalently, what it does is gives it almost uniform sort of periphery, the envelope of glazing, that's the term. Now put glass on the outside, changing how buildings look. They're no longer those, mostly opaque exteriors within which you're putting in walls. It's really a long sort of a band of glass that's going to define the buildings. And it would become more and more possible to create even more large stretches of glass with the advent of plate glass. Before the late 19th century, glass was not only just very expensive, it was very difficult to build. It's a very fragile material. To make good quality glass is very difficult. It was not actually produced in the US until the second half of the 19th century. So a lot of things happened, and this, since I had the term here, these kinds of walls which do not have the responsibility, the task of carrying down the load, they're called curtain walls, like pulling a curtain literally. Okay? I'll come back to that. Now, this is what I had in mind with the example of Chicago that we were discussing yesterday. One of the things that I want to tackle here is, given the examples we have looked at Manchester, we have looked at Chicago, and we're going to look at, since we discussed Athens, we're going to discuss Athens, and then we're going to leap and look at Philadelphia. We're still looking at grids. Now, Shilpa yesterday asked me, why are we looking at grids since very few Indian cities are gridded? So let me make sure you understand why we are looking at gridded cities, okay? A, you do need to know what's happening in other parts of the world to understand what's happening in the Indian subcontinent. Absolutely necessary, okay? Otherwise you don't know why this is peculiar, okay? What makes this an appropriate vocabulary? And second is that there's something about grids that is very attractive for certain kinds of objectives, city building objectives. And if it's for a commercial city, it is eminently sensible. In other words, it is an efficient system of organizing space. But it's also very old, and it's important to recognize different kinds of grids. The ancient grid of Miletus we looked at, I'm going to return to that today, just to make sure we are all on the same plane. But also to begin to understand, how do we actually go about analyzing whether it's a gridded city or a not gridded city. That's why we're going to start with Athens. Not gridded city, definitely. In other words, this segment is about spatial analysis. How do we, today and tomorrow we're going to talk about that. How do we analyze space? And we're talking about urban space. But when we're talking about urban space, the reason I introduced the buildings, individually, is that you do need to move from the building scale or the interior scale to other scales. It's easy to say you have to move, but it's not quite evident how you do so. In other words, how do you connect different scales? Where do you begin? Do you begin with the small scale and move to the large one? And how large? Do you move to the city scale, to the regional scale? What are you hoping to get from that? And what you start with will have an impact on, or rather where you start with will have an impact on what you find. In other words, you're making connection. Think of it as weaving. You're taking a thread and you're weaving different kinds of materials. What you start with and what you end with will actually define the analytic fabric. I hope that's clear. Okay, we're going to talk about that more. So how do cities come into existence? By fiat. Somebody says this city will be built. Okay, in other words, these are authorities, whether they are kings and princes or planners. Usually we don't think of planners doing by fiat because there is still a consultative process. And there is that kind of the slow growth from a trading center, it becomes something larger. We will still can place cities like Chicago and Manchester in that second, sort of category. That there was something there. It's not like nothing. There's rarely a situation where there's nothing there, and city grows. There always has to be something. Otherwise, there's no reason to for a city to grow there or build a city there. And the other is just agglomeration. And there is because in Greek city-states, and they are cities which are city-states, the term is synocism. In other words, small villages coming together as one polity. That's the process of synocism. In other words, the political and the formal come together as one entity. So let's think about, while we're thinking about why, how do cities come into existence? Another question is, since we looked at Manchester and Chicago, and we're going to look at many big cities, how do they become dominant? I mean, the answer is not obvious. A lot of effort, a lot of sort of parts have to fall together. A lot of things have to be assembled to ensure that the city gains dominance. In other words, it's a political process. So the questions we would ask, and power at the city scale and power at a small scale today and the next day, is one, of course, is hegemony. That is, the population decides to acquiesce to a dominant power. That's the classic definition of hegemony. Second is, it's okay whether it's hegemony or outright dominance. How is power actually exercised? Because that first one doesn't explain how it is actually exercised. How do we analyze space to understand how power works? And by power, I mean I have a very expansive notion of power. Power doesn't mean it has to be explicit political power. It's about social relations, about social hierarchies, about how hierarchies are organized and maintained. And the last one is politics. In other words, what form does the operation of power take? It could be informal, it could be, of course, like a governmental, right? It could be municipal, but it could also be other forms. And we're going to look at the effect of these different forms of operating. So spatial analysis. So I came up with a kind of a laundry list of what you can think of in terms of spatial analysis. It's extremely important where you start. In In other words, what's your starting point? Whether you're starting with an object, you can start a city analysis with an object. Whether you're starting with a plan, whether you're starting with one aspect of the city, you're starting with people, you're starting with a small scale or large scale, you'll get entirely different answers based on that. So scalar movement and scalar manipulation has something to do with what your findings will look like. In other words, you set this up in your research. Nobody else does. And whenever you're looking at, published research, always pay attention to what's the entree? Like where to enter, where to begin, where to start. That's always an important question. And it's important for storytelling, but it's important for analysis as well. And scale. Which scales are you going to attend to? Are you going to attend to what I call the small scale, which is not necessarily, dimensionally small, but those that are neglected, marginalized. My last book is about small spaces, where I made an argument that by looking at small spaces, they could be service spaces, they could be kitchens, they could be warehouses, and warehouses are not small, dimensionally small, they can be massive. But there's no architectural history of warehouses. I can find only about 2 works that you would actually deal with it, because they are not seen as self-evident as for deserving architectural analysis. I cannot think of how you conduct trade without significantly tending to warehouses as a building type. That's tremendously important. So the idea of small spaces is that you can think of beginning with the less recognized spaces and the actors who operate in those spaces. You'll get a very different understanding of colonialism, and that's what I was looking at, British colonialism, that you'll get a very different answer about colonialism and how, relations under colonial rule work if you start with those, as opposed to starting with big buildings, master plans, etc., which will almost always reiterate the dominant voice. It's very difficult to, avoid that. Okay? So you begin with the dominant voice. I can assure you, you will end up with the dominant voice. In other words, ventriloquizing the dominant voice. So the third part is evidence. How do you assemble evidence? Seems like a very basic research question. And here I want to you to think about, some of you are probably already doing it, some of you are probably not, given your disciplinary training. As architectural and urban historians, and I'm an architect turned architectural historian, we are very adept at looking at visual material. And visual materials could be architectural plans, it could also be paintings, it could be drawings and sketches, but how to bring them in conversation with not just written documents, how to kind of evaluate them, how to put them together. Like what kind of conversation do you want between or among different kinds of evidence is very important. But it's also, and if you have read the Upton piece, there's something about not just visual evidence, but how do you understand the experience, not just the visual experience, which is the dominant experience, and that's how powerful entities try to present cities and really all built form. But what about the olfactory? How do you know? Can you tell me how spaces smell? I know all of you can, but where is the history of that? Like, can we historicize that? What are the understanding of oral culture? In other words, not just oral culture, but noise, sound. What does cities? What did cities sound like? Right? There are some works on that, but it's useful to think about how do we take these different kinds of evidence and create a coherent story. Like in other words, ultimately it's of course the questions you're asking, right? You will not be doing everything in one project, but something to think about. Because the first 3 impact whose story you're going to tell, who are the actors in your story. Now you could choose your actors first, okay, and then see which spaces they operate. Where do they? Where is the evidence of them, operating anything, right? In their working, their lives, and so on and so forth. And the one that I think very important, and that's vantage. And this is an old question that Raymond Williams asked. With whom do you stand? With whom do you identify? This is paramount. No research is neutral. You are taking a position. And be very careful about what position you take. You do need to identify what that position is. Which actor are you privileging? I'm not saying that you should look at either marginalized or elite. That's not the point. The point is still positioning yourself and the subjects in places that will give a critical perspective. Because if research is not critical, it's not worth doing. The last is materiality, and this is very difficult. Because all of these things ultimately end up into understanding material relations and social relations. How do we understand materiality? And materiality is complex because it's everything, really. It's not one thing. You have to be able to think about how materials have been assembled and their social meaning. One way to think about this, if you think about this wall, there's a wall here. Can we talk about the materiality? What would you say about the materiality of this wall? If that's what you had to do. If you don't answer this, this will be the subject of the tutorial today, okay? How would you go about it? What is a wall? I know somebody's working on walls, I heard, yeah.
It's the foundational structure in architecture, and it can be of different types, one load-bearing and non-load-bearing. There can be all-enclosing walls used as the boundary of partitions, that type specifically.
Okay. So in other words, walls are a basic building element, okay? Very good. And they can be made of lots of different materials, okay? If we spend some time, we can actually figure out what this is made of, and it's not that difficult actually, okay? Once we know the constructional system of this building, it's really easy. But the question is not that. You could ask, like, questions, like minute questions about that. Ultimately, a wall is a set of social relations. Somebody produced that wall. Do you know who produced that wall? No. Why don't you know that?
Because the labor procedure that went to it is abstracted,
And it's, you'll have a very hard time finding even a single name of any of these people who actually built this wall. Even if you looked at the archival documents, which I'm sure is there somewhere with some architect, some planner, maybe in this university, right? But a building also, since you said it encloses, but the wall also separates, right? So it's a mechanism for separating. Whom does it separate, right? Whom does it connect? Whom does it enclose? So it's all, these are all social questions you're asking. So it's important to think of all building materials and the materiality of structures and urbanism, and at any level, whether it's a sidewalk or a tall building, in terms of social relations. In other words, how do we translate them into social relations, as social relations? So we're going to return to these, what I call my laundry list of what constitutes spatial analysis later. So let's go back, since we were talking about Athens and there was no visuals to go by. So Athens was a polis. So we are talking, of course, a particular moment in the history of Athens. This is 5th century Athens in the height of its hegemony. In other words, it has it's a leader of the Delian League. It has enormous power among the Greek city-states because it has emerged from the Persian attacks as a victor. Okay, so it's one of those few centuries that it's really building itself, right? Athens is being rebuilt because it was completely sacked. And so there's a particular architectural moment. That's something that interests architectural historians. So Aristotle's notion was that there are two dimensions of a polis. And polis is not just a physical entity. It's a political, means it's a moral, ethical commitment. Okay? So one is material, that this polis must sustain itself. Okay? In other words, you have to think about how it's going to sustain itself. But the other is political, and that is to cultivate, which was very important for them, speech. speech in particular was called out from everything else. That you had to, for example, when the only male Athenians were citizens who had to participate, who were obliged to participate in the political process, they had to, in an open gathering, say yes or no to every decision. In other words, you were located in place. Everybody knew what you were deciding, what your opinion is. You could not avoid that. So in other words, the organization of whether it's a council chamber or it's the open theater where you sat, it's a kind of a positioned space of locution. It is known. It is not something you could avoid. There's no privacy here. Okay, that I know my voting is confidential. None of that. This is a participatory democracy, limited. Most people are either enslaved, women, or metics, outsiders. Some of the greatest Athenians are metics. But those who participated in, they were under certain obligations. Something to think about. But he also said to try to unify a city excessively is not good. In other words, do not force consent. Not just discussion, but dissent is important. Otherwise, there is no political process. Something to, think about. So I wanted to have this map, not just because I just love maps, because I'm also very critical of them, because I think it will help you understand the geographical location of Athens in Greece. So this is the pole of Attica, and this is the Aegean, and all of these yellow parts are basically, Athenian, under Athenian Aegean, and this is the Persian Empire, a humongous territorial entity. So this is the moment we are looking at, where Athens emerges as the leader of the Delian League. In other words, it controls the treasury. Okay? And Pericles, as the head honcho of the league, had no compunction of spending the treasury on Athens and building its buildings. So that's why we have this enormous production of buildings, in particular in the Acropolis, but also in other places. And something I I'll be referring to later. So it's important to recognize. So this is the port of Athens, Piraeus, and the long walls were created to defend the passage of ships. Grain was extremely important, because that's one thing that Athens and these Greek city-states did not produce, which was grain. They were very good at oil and wine and all of that, pottery, but grain they had to actually source from a distance. So it was very important for the survival of the army to actually protect the trade of grain, or the import of grain. And this is Salamis. This is the Battle of Salamis was the deciding factor in favor of the Athenians. So its geography is important. So one way to, and I'm doing a very simplified explanation here. One way to understand Athens is that it has two parts. It has the Acropolis, which is the sacred city, and the polis, which is the agora, the marketplace. Okay? So this is all of this, and it's a walled city. Walls have been built and rebuilt many times. This is on higher ground. That's the Acropolis. So this is the digital reconstruction of the Acropolis in 5th century Athens by my colleagues at UCLA. They patiently recreated the landscape to give you a good understanding of what the topography was like, because they had a particular argument about the topography and the buildings. Because when you look at this image, you recognize, well, there's clear distinction between higher ground and lower ground, like sacred city, not sacred, profane, right? And there's clearly a connection between the two. There's a path, that's the Panathenic way, which would, be the channel through which the entire, think of it, citizenry moves up to celebrate Athena on her birthday. So the Panathenic procession takes that way, so connecting the profane with the sacred, that's all good. But it still didn't explain a lot about Athens. In other words, if you look at the organization of buildings in Athens, because it is not a gridded city, you go like, what's the logic of this space? Like, how do you even begin? The Athenians were notorious, apparently, I'm not a ancient scholar. I take it from my colleagues who work on that. Is that they were notorious for not embellishing their private spaces, domestic spaces. Domestic spaces were spaces of the enslaved servants and women, and they were very simple, courtyard houses. In other words, you entered through an opening. There's a courtyard, and there is andron, which is the reception room, kitchen, dining room, which is your male space. I always think of it in Bengali terms of Boitakkhana, but you won't eat there necessarily. But that's the kind of a dining space. It's a very male space, and there's as you can see, these are columns. So this is a porch, and this building form you find pretty much everywhere in the world. Okay, a courtyard house around a house around built around a courtyard in one form or another. So there's nothing, let's call it nothing particularly distinguished, but there's a big distinction between private and public space. So this is the agora. There's no good translation, but agora is the marketplace. Think of it as the marketplace civic space. Now if you look at the disposition of these buildings, you go, why are they kind of located like that? It begs for some kind of answer, because the logic is not evident. Remember in Miletus, when we were looking at the Greek colonial city, we said, oh, it's all aligned with the grid, right? But in this case, it is not. So what works? So one of the peculiarities of these Greek cities is that there were a distinct set of building types. Remember building types? It's one class of buildings where form and function come together in a discernible whole. So one of the singular buildings, this one, the Skias Astolos, was one of the few round buildings they have. They were typically rectangular or square construction. And the Bouleuterion is the council chamber. This is basically, you could sit around this space. In other words, think of it as a space for discussion, but also dining. And some of these, this one has actually a gallery. In other words, step seating. And this one, these are some small spaces where, not that small, but smaller spaces than an open, large amphitheater, where these are meant for discussion, and this is civic discussion, political discussion. And then there are these buildings are called stoas. Okay? That's a distinct building type. And these are the ones rectangular structure with the surrounding colonnade. Those are temples. And there are lots of temples. So one of the things that my colleagues did, this is Samantha Martin McClough and John Cocklevolas, is that they actually explained why these buildings are aligned this way. And that's what I want you to think about. In other words, how do you do that spatial analysis? Stoa is one of the most versatile building types ever. It is utterly simple. It has 3 sides. This side long, short. It can have one row of columns which is holding up the roof, or it can have 2 rows of columns. The function of a stoa is that you can have rooms here, but it could be shops, it could be all sorts of other purposes, but it provides a long promenade. Here the columns act as both kind of something you can walk along, but it also frames the view. And stoa is what you get the term stoic from, because philosophers would promenade, walk up and down. So there's a relation between use of this space by various groups. In this case, the philosophers. In other words, these are kind of, think of them as heterogeneous spaces, like multiple uses. It's just not for, let's say, shopping or buying things, it's also for conversing. And this is the basic model of any other, when we think of galleries, where you have a series of columns against a wall, when we think of art galleries. I showed you the Loggia of Florence. They're basically derived from the stoa. And it's an extremely versatile building form because it takes very little to actually construct it. But it is a kind of a long, funny looking, because it's a long. So this is the stoa and stoa had multiple purposes. Some of the stoas were used for displaying war booty, trophies, and so on and so forth. Others were for, like commercial purposes. Others were, promenade conversation. So they could be two-storied or they could be one-story. Okay, in other words, there is a lot of leeway in these. Okay, and just so you know, these were reconstructed much later. So this is to give you a sense of the types of public spaces, public buildings that you could find in the Agora, but also among them what kind of public space they created. In a way, the one that was sort of set away from the Agora because it required a slope, it required a gradient on which to build this structure, is the theatre. And it was very important, not just for actually theatrical performances, but also for political performances, literally, because this is where you can actually gather the entire citizen. And it has, this is the proscenium, this is where we get the idea for proscenium. In other words, this elevation shows this view, you're looking this way, and this is the section, so this is the stage, this is the orchestra, the seating, it is, basically you're carving the hills to create the seating, and it is in a round shape, so it is naturally acoustic. So it's in a way it's a brilliant move. But so these are the kind of public spaces that which constituted the larger public space of the Agora and of Athens. So the relation between the profane and sacred space. One is that you could always see the Acropolis from this is you're looking at the South Stoa. From this stoa, you could always see. This is again a reconstruction view. You could always see the stoa. Now from the Agora, from different points of it, you could see not just the stoa, not just the Acropolis, but a framed view. You could never not see that, it was never absent from your mind. In other words, it was always there as a reminder of the guardian deity of Athens. Now, the path that led up to the Acropolis was clearly the one street that was clearly marked, And there's in this entire sequence, starting from the gate of the city, across the Agora, which would, sort of processionally march up. People would, carrying lots of offerings, would march up. It's a very choreographed space. In other words, that route, since Abhishek is interested in routes, this is actually a route that is particularly planned to be not just processional, but very choreographed. Who carries what at what time, and how you enter the space. So what is interesting is that here is small temple of Athena Nike, and this is actually much older structure. So the site has been built and rebuilt many, many times. So you're entering this, what looks like a building, is actually a gate, and you're constricted. So from open space, you are going to a constricted space because of the gate. And then, so that's the propylaea, the gateway. Once you are there, the gate, it's massive, and it is a building type in itself. In other words, it's not just a thin layer of gate, but it has actually spaces right next to it. And when you are here, this is the white steps, it narrows. So you're constricted. And then it dramatically opens up to show first the statue of Athena, in the forecourt, and then at an angle, the Parthenon, the most important temple on the Acropolis. So they are being placed in terms of what you are expected to view, what you're expected to think of while you are taking this procession. So again, they're very choreographed. And so you're coming from here to the Parthenon, and this is what I call the architecture of movement. This is clearly the destination. The reason the building looks like this, I'm going to get into that. It was never actually like this. It was a colorful building. It was, highly embellished. So this is what the ruins look like this. And it is a tall structure based on a high, it has a high base, And inside, again, these are reconstruction drawings, images. So it would be a gold-clad, gold-plated statue of Athena the maiden. And the structure itself is very interesting because it has, again, it's something very simple about it. There's an inner chamber, the treasury would be here, and there's one row of columns outside. So you have basically between two sets of columns, or the wall and the column, a passage. So the building is encircled by a passage. So you know that you're expected to circumambulate. In other words, the columns always guide your movement and they frame your view. This is a constant thing that these columns do. Since I might come back to this, if you don't know, these are the basic 4 parts of a Greek temple. This is the base, that's the column, that's the entablature, this is the pediment, the triangular thing is the pediment. And I'm going to refer to the metapiece here. This is part of the entablature, it has different parts in it. I don't expect you to remember it. It is important to know that they had particular functions because particular representations, figures went into them. And again, there's something to do with sight, there's something to do with what you're expected to think about. In the metapiece here you have the eternal adversaries, Lapids and Centaurs, Greeks and Amazons fighting it out, and the pediment is reserved for the gods. Okay. But dramatically, once you enter, the procession sees itself represented along the frieze at the top. So in other words, here you move from the mythical and the divine to seeing yourself represented. So the representations of the frieze, and this is the details of which element was where. This is it's called the peplos scene. In other words, the carrying of the garment of the maiden, which has been woven by the maids. And this is if you have read your poetry, English poetry, this is the heifer, in other words, sacrificial cow. And then, of course, the soldiers and person. This is what is considered one of the most important achievements of Greek sculpture, because you're working with stone, which is, difficult. It wants to be fixed. This is the dynamism in these buildings, is that everything about the building seems like it's fixed in place. Every element of it is asking you to notice its dynamism. It's about movement, really. It's not about stasis. And this one, trying to show the galloping horses, you're working in bas relief. That relief is intended to show the straining muscles, the heaving, and the sort of the strain and stress of the whole endeavor. So the processional and the sort of the attributes of the space continues into the Erechtheion, which is the structure here. So Erechtheion also, it is known for its caryatid porch. Even here, the caryatids almost are stepping out of the frame. These are the human figures which are acting as columns. So in other words, something about dynamism and movement and making it almost like a ripple is very evident in the stone work. When the procession is exiting through the propylaea, that's how they will exit. They see Salamis. So you can always remember the source of victory, the site of victory, and the reason why the celebration is taking place. The glory of Athena is enmeshed in everyday life and yourself, so you are participating in it, and you're always reminded that there is Salamis. That's what made it happen. So think of it as a very warlike culture, but it's also very much about instilling a certain spatial ideology among the citizenry. And here it's not just the men. Here there are women, there are servants, and other people who are participating in it. Okay, so one way to think about all of this is that you're bringing together the entire community into a spatial ideology. Now, if you went to architecture school when I did, which I say in the Jurassic period, are, until, most folks never knew anything about the Parthenon. You were always taught the Parthenon, that it was anything but white stone, and the fact that it was actually had life as a church for centuries. It had a life as a mosque as centuries, because all of this was cleansed in the 19th century when the modern Greek state came into existence. So its Christian and Muslim Ottoman history was wiped out. What this means that the building was, of course, very removed from 5th century Athens. The desire to return it to that time, you could argue that that's the object, right? You want to find the origins of their pride. You want to think about Salamis again, and so on and so forth. But that building was colored. These are the images, just so you know, from the British Museum. They've recreated what these sculptures must have looked like. It gives you an entirely different sense of what the building must have felt. In not just I was talking about the dynamism in terms of, think of it as a texture, but it's also color. It's not just the bas relief, it's the color that will strike you first before the relief does. And the reason it is because this is the rise of 18th century neoclassical theory, which literally whitened and whitewashed all of neoclassical architecture. This is also the rise of European imperialism, and that required art history to abide by certain rules of what is neoclassicism. The fact that we think of neoclassical buildings as white buildings with the marble are painted is a ruse. That's what they are. So they are actually never, neoclassical in Greece. If you are thinking of Greece, they were really not like that. But it's very difficult to maintain this. In fact, you can see in these decorative, this is that. That's what. Color needs to be maintained, otherwise it'll fray. It'll dissolve in the rain and wind. What is interesting is that when policies or political entities like Athens created colonies and marked their sort of hegemony on those colonies, on those cities, they carried with them their building construction style, which is the trabeation, in other words, lintels and columns, very simple but very effective, and also the building types. I discussed that a little yesterday. So since we are going to talk about colonialism in the next two lectures, I want to make sure we are all on the same page, that colonialism is about extraction of resources. I think you know this, but it's all for the benefit of the home country, but it's also for geopolitical advantages. In other words, why take the trouble of colonizing a distant place if it doesn't, give you some kind of geopolitical advantage? So the spatial organization of Athens is radically different from Miletus or Miletus. One is gridded, the other is not. One looks like haphazard, but this is what our colleagues did with the digital reconstruction. One way you can actually make a convincing argument, that's how they're using digital reconstruction, to say that, see, you can actually see the logic of the relation among the buildings. It is the view, it is the movement that holds the space together. It is not a grid. In other words, it's through practice that the spatial ensemble is held together. Same thing with in Miletus, the organization of the public spaces. They have the agora, they have the temple, they have the council chamber, all of that. They have the amphitheater, everything except that they're actually much larger. It's like massive scale. So the scale is enhanced, and they are also perfectly geometrically aligned with the grid. So the spatial experience would be entirely different. How they were actually used in practice, that's a different ballgame. And lots of scholars are working on these cities, Greek colonial cities in Turkey, whether it's Priena, Ephesus, or Miletus, and trying to figure out how did the conquered population or indigenous populations deal with Greek hegemony and how they counteracted them. And very interesting work, and it's worth reading. Now, we are going to launch into colonialism of the modern era. We're not talking about Greek, little polis trying to conquer the neighborhood, cities in the neighborhood. So nominally, it has become customary to make a distinction between settler and non-settler colonialism. I will start with that and then I will complicate that later. So we're talking about settler colonialism, and I'm going to bring up the example of Philadelphia to make the points that Anglo-settler colonialism is that settler colonialism has the colony. The first criteria is that they have to have a, colonization requires a colony, establishment of the colony. But here the goal is to settle in perpetuity. Ultimately, claiming indigenous, that you are the people who are of the land, and the people who were the indigenous people are not, because they have been either exterminated, they have died because of diseases, or they have been removed from the land. The most egregious and most overt of this was in Australia, because the policy of terra nullius, which is in vacant land, claimed that indigenous people had no right to the land, negated all their rights, basically ignored their presence. The land was found vacant for colonization. In one way or another, all settler colonial powers do that. They might use that term or they might not use that term. But how sovereignty is claimed, how the right to rule, in a very crude definition of sovereignty, the right to rule, right to self-determination, is claimed in this land, and how cities are produced to ensure this claim. It's useful to think of one of the earlier examples. This is the founding of Pennsylvania, the what is now a state. But at the time, you're talking about Philadelphia, the city, and Pennsylvania as the, sort of think of it as the kind of the colony, the historical principality. So William Penn was given a charter by Charles II. They gave him the land, and this is allowed him to found a city. Now, how did Charles II come up with the idea that he can't even give away the land? That is, of course, that's one of those fabulations one imagines, a political fabulation, that the land somehow is there to give away. Because you can only do that if you think the land is not inhabited, okay? Or the people have given up their claims on it, but the people haven't given up their claims. So we are talking about this part here, and it was very well populated. And long afterwards, in the late 18th century, the appropriation of the land was justified through multiple pictorial representation. One of the most important one is Benjamin West's Penn's Treaty with the Indians. And these kinds of paintings have a particular visual rhetoric. They're always about willingly giving away the right to the land. And you can say, why bother with these representations? Actually, why bother with these representations? Like, who are you kidding? I mean, that's my colloquial way of saying. But why bother with these representations? You're occupying the land, and you have successfully removed the people. You have successfully, in some way or another, managed to acquire a treaty, about ceded land. Why bother with visual representation?
For circulation among the public
That's possible, but many of these were singular paintings. Of course, prints were made of those, right? But why commission these, paintings, and why would a painter embark on this? Because the visual rhetoric that you see here, the willing Indian who's being given, and as if the offer is really being made to them, right? The peaceful exchange, and William Penn and his followers were Quakers. Peace is important to them, as a kind of as a moral requirement. So why? Yeah.
It's a method of controlling the narrative and saying that yes, I've done this, but it was done in a consensual manner. Yeah, sort of like that.
Very good. In other words, what you're doing is you're really producing evidence. Okay? You're producing visual evidence of, because there are no photographs here, right? Okay, so you're producing visual evidence, anticipating the creation of a founding narrative and also something that is going to be perpetuated. And it is, another time we can discuss the organization of the image in terms of its, the particularities and how the figures are deployed. But the fact is that multiple reasons, and between disease, between, impossible treaty terms, the Penn and his family, his son, they were able to acquire large, I'm talking about significant amount, a chunk of the land. But it is useful to think about what this entailed. So when the idea of settling the colony, you're looking for investors in England. When there was advertised, the idea was that for every 500 acres of land purchase, you will get 10 acres in the city. Here is your connection between the country and a city. In other words, they are being planned at the same time. Okay, so 10 acres is significant, as we know. In a city, is significant, and you get 500 acres. So this is the terms. So people in England can not only buy, but then you can of course speculate. You can sell it, right? So you might want to buy it right then, and then hope that in a few years you'll get even a better price. So you are, think of this, you're buying this, at a price it was to benefit the Penn family. But you are also hoping that you will reap far more revenue from this than you are spending now. And I'm going to use this one and then stop. So the plan that came about, and I'm going to begin with this in my next lecture, is that it is a very controlled grid. And the grid came from, we can look at what are the sources of this plan, because there are grids and there are grids. And it's between the Delaware River there and the Schuylkill River here. And it has that central square, which is the dominant figure. So we can talk about open spaces, street systems, and what happens, the intention of the plan, and how it actually gets inhabited. That's all for this one.